Thank you, Patty. Our speaker today is U.S. District Court Judge John Tunheim. He was born in northern Minnesota, went to college at Concordia in Moorhead, and then the University of Michigan, or University of Minnesota Law School. He did some work for Senator Hubert Humphrey, and then worked, which is where I got to know the judge, in the Minnesota Attorney General's office when Skip Humphrey was the AG. The judge served as the Solicitor General and then as Chief Deputy, and if I'm remembering correctly, argued a case in the U.S. Supreme Court at that time. And one of the things the Attorney General has to do is to defend state statutes, whether the Attorney General really likes the law or not. So he may touch on that in terms of what democracy involves. And in 1995, he was nominated by President Bill Clinton to serve as U.S. District Court Judge here in Minnesota. And he has been there now for just a few days short of 27 years. He was Chief Judge for 7 years, which has to be, and I can say this as a lawyer who practiced in courtrooms in 2 different states for 40 years, kind of like herding cats, only probably a little bit more difficult. As a district court judge, he's had a couple of interesting assignments. For 2 years, he was the chairman of the Assassination Records Review Board, which oversaw the collection of records related to the assassination of President Kennedy. So he does know who shot JFK. And one of the other things that he has done and that he'll be talking about today is his involvement in spreading the rule of law, particularly among the new democracies in Eastern Europe. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the judiciary in Minnesota has been very involved in that. Judge Tunheim helped draft the Constitution for Kosovo and also worked advising 40 different countries in counterterrorism and judicial independence. And I'm sure that's something he'll talk about because that's a pretty important thing in democracies. So with that, I'd like to introduce Judge Jack Tunheim.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. It's great to see you again. And I think I was at a Rotary Club meeting years ago when I first met Bill Klump, who was an assistant Washington County attorney, and got to know him. And then I was very proud to steal him from the Washington County Attorney's Office for the Attorney General and give him to the entire state instead of just Washington County. And if you haven't had a program where he can talk about his many cases all over the state over the years, I think that would be fascinating, because he was off prosecuting bad guys and rascals everywhere across the state of Minnesota. I think the last case I worked with him on was a noted rascal named John Remington Graham, who was a Crow Wing County attorney who had very different ideas about what the law should be. So ask him to speak sometime on all those cases. It would be very interesting. And you're right, being a chief judge is like herding cats. Judges are very independent. I liken it to being similar to the job of being the director of a cemetery. There's a lot of people under you, but no one's listening. So that's kind of what it's like being a chief judge. Anyone who's been in the position will probably agree with that. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. And one of my staff members, one of my law clerks, Mara Clay, is here with me as well. I have law clerks who have recently graduated from law school. They're the top students, and they help me with a lot of different parts of my job as a district court judge here in Minnesota, and we cover the entire state. I want to talk about a project that we have undertaken in our office. I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview first. There, it worked. I hit the wrong key. I'm getting IT advice here, so. And I have a little bit of a slideshow to show you in a little bit, but I want to preface that for a bit. You know, we do a really good job here in the District of Minnesota of welcoming new citizens to our state. And if you ever want to have a program where we have maybe 10 or 12 new citizens sworn in, be happy to do that. I think you would be really delighted to have new citizens being admitted here and the chance to properly welcome them to living in Minnesota. We, on the average, administer the oath of citizenship to about 15,000 new citizens in Minnesota every year. They are, for the most part, very productive members of our state and our economy, and it's the best thing that I do as a judge is to administer the oath of citizenship to new citizens. And the sad fact is that many of them know more about our democracy and our Constitution and the rule of law in our country than people who are born here. All of us who are born here and have had the good fortune to be born here in the United States, and our rights and responsibilities and protections were granted to us by birthright. And we probably don't think too much about citizenship. Maybe in recent years, as this issue has become more prominent, you have. But not too long ago, in a test administered by Newsweek magazine, nearly 40% of the people tested in a large group of people who took the test could not pass the written test that is required of immigrants before they can attain citizenship in the United States. And that number is shocking to me. It's once in a while we look back to the past, to wise people who traveled across this country, de Tocqueville being one of them. He had a very astute observation of democracy in the age of Jackson, noting that a democracy is so much better when everyone participates. And he was really correct. The participation of Americans in civic life is essential, really, to sustaining our democratic form of government. And in our electronic age, levels of civic engagement, by almost any measure you can find, are falling, as are levels of civic knowledge. Just some facts for you. In 2016 and in 2020, national surveys conducted by the Annenberg Public Policy Center, 1 in 4 Americans were unable to name the 3 branches of government. 32% of those could not even name a single branch. A Freedom Forum survey demonstrated that 1/3 of Americans cannot name any of the 5 rights that are protected by the First Amendment. And any of the rights, of course, include the freedom of speech, which I assumed most everyone knew that was protected here in our country. So are our young people better informed? The clear answer to that is no. 70% of 12th graders have never written a letter or a message to express an opinion on an important issue. 30% have never participated in any kind of discussion or debate on public issues. And according to the Center for Civics Literacy at Indiana University, the United States over the past 50 years has spent 1,000 times more per student on STEM education than on history and civics. I, of course, have nothing against STEM education, although I wasn't particularly good at science. And science and math, of course, are very important, and those skills have definitely improved in our country. You can see the impact of this emphasis, which is a growing civics illiteracy. We have wonderful social studies and civics teachers in Minnesota. One of my civics teachers in high school was the inspiration for me deciding I wanted to be a lawyer. But I think one can argue that they are among the least supported of the teachers in our school system in the state. We've done a lot of work with social studies teachers to help us develop our centers, and I can attest that they feel abandoned in many respects by their schools. With lack of knowledge comes diminished trust and confidence in our democratic institutions, which is not hard to see if you follow the news in the last 5 to 6 years. Trust in the federal judiciary, which has always been relatively high in our country, according to a recent Gallup poll, has dropped to 54%, which was a huge drop from where it was. And before the last term, this is 2 years old now, only 40% believed that the United States Supreme Court was doing its job in a proper way. I haven't seen a poll since the decisions of the last term, but I suspect that that number has dropped more. As a judiciary, though, we fare a lot better than Congress, where trust generally measures between 5 and 10% of the population. And so our new American citizens could and will do much better in their levels of knowledge. And I could continue. There's a lot of statistics that show this, but I think the message is clear. A lack of knowledge of our democratic institutions, the role of each branch of our government, the important role of each branch, and the important lessons that history teaches us from our past. The steadying value of our Constitution. It's the world's oldest written Constitution that's still in effect. But basic understandings of how the government works and how incredibly fair we really do run our elections in the United States. I've been an election monitor in half a dozen countries around the world, and comparatively speaking, they try very hard. They try very hard to run fair and free elections, and it's hard to do. And it's not hard for us to do that in the United States. We do that really, really well. But a lot of people don't believe that in this day and age, and that's really based on not only false information, but on just a lack of basic understanding about how our government works. So what this does is leave our citizens incredibly vulnerable, I think, to destructive populist rhetoric and to fear and bitterness and ultimately strife. And importantly, decreasing respect for our constitutional processes here in the United States. I've had the good fortune to participate a number of times in panel discussions with the author, Anne Applebaum, who is a terrific person, but she's written often of the urgent need to, what she says, restore the guardrails of democracy. I think that's a great phrase for a challenging period. The Chief Justice of the United States, and I'm going to show this in just in a moment, has observed, I think very accurately, that Americans have come to take democracy for granted, and civics education has fallen by the wayside. And he challenged us in the federal judiciary to help to fight this trend, and we in the District of Minnesota have taken him up on this challenge. As a court, we have long taken a quiet approach to reaching out to our community. For many years, we've organized judges and lawyers to speak in schools throughout the state on topics very relevant to the legal world. Open Doors is the name of the program that has been our vehicle to go into schools around the state and help young people understand the law. We took an important lead in the last several years in establishing a large coalition of law groups that help to bring an in-depth focus to commemorating the horrific racial lynching terror that occurred in Duluth in 1920, a source of a real sore for our state, and assisted in helping ensure a posthumous pardon for the one Black American who was falsely convicted of rape not long after the lynchings of 3 Black Americans. Our programs over the years have drawn attention to the importance of our Indian treaties, which are still in effect, to the diversity of our judges, to the impact of the Dred Scott decision, and I can talk at great length about the Dred Scott decision and how that developed. It was not just a single Supreme Court decision, it was a series of decisions and cases that went all over the map for poor Dred Scott, who was freed not long after the decision denying him freedom, and then he did not survive a bout with tuberculosis. We've talked about racially discriminatory internment camps and the important work of Jewish lawyers during in Nazi Germany before World War II, and we've done outreach as best as we've been able. Just yesterday, we were the primary sponsor of a student contest on the Bill of Rights throughout the districts within the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, with prizes for essays that were well done and presentations. It's just a fun event, and those are students who know our Constitution. We're not at the forefront of campaigns. We can't be as a court. We can't be leading social movements. That's impossible. But we do understand that addressing America's problems will require us all. And we're taking important new steps, I think, to answer Chief Justice Roberts' call to action. Let me show you some slides. I never remember how to make this thing work, but I think I can. Let's see. There we go. All right. Chief Justice Roberts, in his end of the year remarks in 2019, said, hey, you've got an obligation here, folks. It's a continuing enterprise and a conversation. And each generation has an obligation to pass on to the next a functioning government, and that's responsive to the needs of people, but has the tools to understand and improve it. So we started with getting support from our circuit before the Chief Justice's remarks. We were denied our initial request for judiciary funding to do a build-out of these centers, and then the Chief Justice's report came out, and we renewed our request, and it immediately was granted. Shows you that at least one judge in the United States has some power. But we've had this work being done. We are opening our St. Paul Center probably by March, and Minneapolis will be a couple of years after. In Minneapolis, we've experienced what many of you probably have experienced, is that initial estimates of construction costs are usually have to be increased by 50 or 60% when it actually comes right down to construction time. Okay, so we have we're planning to have museum quality interactive education centers that are really geared toward junior high levels, senior high levels, maybe upper elementary schools for kids to come in. We have worked with our court, our staff. We've worked with an educator from the Minnesota History Center. We've got a lot of input from the numerous affinity bar associations, which have kind of a special purpose, bar associations that are established for African American attorneys, for women lawyers. Different affinity bars have helped us, and social studies educators that are that throughout the Twin Cities area that have worked with us. These are the content areas initially for our St. Paul Center. The topic of what is justice. Kids will have the opportunity to write on a card, put up on a wall what they think justice is, what does justice means. We'll hope to help them understand that. And foundations and frameworks really talk about our government, how it is established, who does what in our system. And we have a section on landmark cases, how they will relate to kids, primarily to young people, how they were resolved, how they were developed, and these are important cases that young people need to know about. One of them, of course, will be a case of Tinker versus Des Moines from quite a while ago, but it was a case where school officials banned students from wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. And the Supreme Court said that was not permitted. They had a right to wear those armbands under the First Amendment. And we hope to have Ms. Tinker, the plaintiff in the case, with us for our grand opening. People of the court, we want to help young people understand who works at the court. What the judge does is pretty obvious to folks, but it's not entirely clear what a court reporter does, what a bailiff does, what a courtroom deputy does, what a security officer does, what the lawyers do, and what jurors do, importantly, because teaching young people about the importance of citizen juries in our country is a big part of this. And then helping people understand that we really are a court of the people. People can come with their issues and problems. We, of course, will have a bench and a robe, and kids can have pictures taken holding a gavel, which is always a very popular part of centers like this. And we have a flex space for rotating content, and we'll rotate the rest of the content on a regular basis. And our theme next year will be the Duluth lynchings, which is probably one of the, along with the hangings of the Dakota Indians at the end of the Civil War, at the end of the Dakota Indian conflict. They are examples of the failure of the rule of law in Minnesota, and there are other examples to give people. And we'll have additional exhibits in Minneapolis because the square footage will be larger. We're going to focus in part on tribal sovereignty, which is a mostly misunderstood issue, and also an interactive on sentencing to help kids understand the difficult decisions that we often have to make as judges do in sentencing. So we're moving along. We're moving along with our marketing plans, intending to promote the centers to educators and schools. The install is starting in our St. Paul Center in the lobby of our federal courthouse in downtown St. Paul on Robert Street. We're going to have volunteer tour guides. It's a great job for retired lawyers, Bill. But the chance to interact with a group of 30 to 40 7th and 8th graders who are there to learn about democracy. Our plan really is to have school groups come in. We're going to provide busing assistance because that's one of the largest roadblocks for schools to, in this day and age, to bring kids on field trips. And have them spend 45 minutes to an hour in the center, and then have the opportunity to go watch part of a court proceeding in a courtroom and talk to the judge afterwards. And we think this will be a remarkable opportunity for young people. And we're also creating lesson plans for educators to use before they bring students to the courthouses so that this can be an ongoing source of study. And so we have gotten funding from the judiciary for the build-outs. That's an appropriated fund. We don't have funds for programmatic activities, so our partners in the Federal Bar Association have raised a considerable amount of money from law firms and from some corporations to help us, and this is paying for the innards, basically. Okay. So this is just a rough mock-up of what it's going to look like when they walk in. Have students discuss what justice means to them. And a lot of the work is being done on interactive devices because that works well with young people. We had initially hoped to have an app available for them, but social studies teachers would rather have us do a website that they can work off of and the kids can work off of, and I think that's probably a good idea. Again, we don't have this installed yet, so this is just a mock-up, but this is our set of landmark cases for one wall of the center, where kids can learn about cases that are of interest to them. And then this is where the people of the court exhibit will come. There's that bench over there to the right for kids to have their picture taken. And an example of where justice has been denied in Minnesota. And the work is underway. As you can see, some of the exhibits are being installed now. They've been prepared by our partners at Split Rock, which is a company in the northern suburbs that works on developing exhibits. They've done a lot of work for the National Park Service, and they've been terrific in what they've come up with for us. Minneapolis will be larger. It'll be a larger center, and we're about 2 years behind in Minneapolis. It'll have much the same, but it'll be a little bit different as well here. We're taking part of our clerk's office in St. Paul. We don't need the space that we formerly needed since everything is electronic in this day and age. So we don't need these huge floor-to-ceiling stacks for paper files anymore. Even our sealed files have been placed electronically now, so nothing needs to stay in paper. And so we have a lot of extra room there. We're taking up that space. Minneapolis, we're taking up the space of a huge storeroom that frankly turned into a huge mess with judges putting all of their stored files and everything in there. So these are just some pictures of what we are expecting our centers to look like. And so some of the topics that we will work on, the rule of law is obviously important to us, and as opposed to the rule of the rule of individuals or the rule of mobs, for example, which happens in many places throughout the world. And this is how we resolve disputes in a civil manner. The Constitution will be on focus, a discussion in some depth of the branches of government, what the difference is between state government and federal government, which a lot of people are widely misunderstand. The types of court cases that come up, the Bill of Rights, the criminal justice process. These are all topics to be discussed. And appellate courts, the important role that appellate courts play. So this is how we will begin marketing. Again, we don't have the details down below, so they've thrown in some Latin language in the meantime. But this will be a way for social studies teachers to find us and to sign up for trips. And we're looking forward to having school kids starting next fall. We do run a court camp in the summer for inner city kids, and that's been very successful. We're returning to it this summer. They'll be there for a couple weeks. So I think I'm really excited about what we're able to do. There are very few of these centers in courthouses across the country. There is one in St. Louis, which is a bit outdated in the courthouse there. There is a small one in Sacramento, and there is a really good one in Manhattan in the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse that the Second Circuit has set up. We're planning in a couple of years to host districts from all around the country to help inspire other districts to do the same thing. And I think overall we can play a role in helping young people better understand our democracy, better understand the rule of law and our Constitution, and hopefully avoid a lot of the misunderstandings that people seem to continue to have about the great value of democracy. It's messy and oftentimes confusing to people, but when you look at the sort of the cutback in civics education, there's a lot of schools that do not have a significant year of social studies where they really focus on civics education. It becomes a 2 or 3 week chapter or so in a longer class combined with other areas. So we hope to make a difference here. I hope it does. We're really looking forward to having kids in St. Paul. They can do a field trip where they can come to our courthouse and they can go to the Science Museum, they can go to the History Center, they can go to the Capitol. It would be quite a day for a young person. And our initial focus really will be a lot of the inner city schools where they don't have the resources to do something like this, and teachers are hard pressed to be able to convey to students what is really important about democracy. So thank you for letting me talk for a while today about this. I hope you'll stop by our courthouse and visit once we start in March, and we look forward to what we can do for the future of democracy. Thank you. Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, and then I have something for you.
Thank you, Judge Tunheim. We have time for just a couple questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. Okay, Mayor, if you'd stand up and maybe say it with your outside voice inside.
Well, I was just thinking, when we're living in such a highly polarized and politicized times, and we have these two left-wing, right-wings all fighting about government, what's the role of the judiciary in that? I mean, is it kind of like a baseball game between two teams and you're the umpire kind of making sure the rules are followed, or how do you see that?
That's a good question. How do we see the role of the judiciary in polarized times like we have right now? We rely very heavily on case precedents. We built on our understanding of the Constitution over these many years since 1789. We don't have a system where judges think, well, my view on this is, and this is how we're going to resolve a case. No, it's the way our system has treated decisions, and the value of precedents, I think, helps stabilize a society, and that's really our role. In any individual trial, as a judge, I'm making hundreds of decisions. You make about probably over 100 a day, in fact, on evidentiary matters that come up in court. And we are, in a sense, applying our rules to what goes on in court. But at the same time, people think judges today are like politicians. And when the articles about the Supreme Court that sort of makes that even worse, because the way people look at how the Supreme Court has changed in recent years. But we really are trying to do our best to apply existing law and apply it fairly to all sides. And we do a good job, I think, even when people bring their own lawsuits. They have pro se parties who aren't represented by lawyers. If we think they have a case, we get them matched up with a lawyer who volunteers to help. And I think that's important, too, to get that message out to people, that it's open to everybody.